It began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting beneath the cold glare of fluorescent lights, staring at page 41 of an unfinished stress test model, with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold beside him. For 11 years, he had lived in the quiet, technical world of credit analysis. He was good enough to see risk before other people saw it, disciplined enough to trace weakness through numbers and footnotes, but never powerful enough to change the direction of anything that truly mattered. He had spent more than a decade identifying danger for other people to manage. Then the phone rang. A lawyer told him that an uncle he had barely known had died and left him a 53% controlling stake in Aldercrest Bank, a $4.2 billion institution. In a matter of seconds, his life turned. But what landed in his hands was not the kind of inheritance a man could simply liquidate and enjoy. Aldercrest was not publicly traded. The shares could not be sold off easily. There were no co-heirs to divide the burden, no buyout clause waiting in the estate documents, no graceful exit already designed for him. In 9 days, he would be expected to step into control. Over the next 6 days, he carried out the deepest review of his professional life. He reopened credit files, quarterly reports, regulatory findings, internal memos, and 8 years of performance data. He searched for the obvious disaster first, some clean, visible event he could name and isolate. But what he found was worse. A bank that still looked stable from the outside while strain had already begun spreading underneath the surface. Tier 1 capital was too thin. Deposit growth had slowed nearly to a stop. Technology was years behind what a healthy institution needed. And a dangerous portion of the loan book was tied to a real estate sector that had already begun to soften month by month. Then he found the detail that made every other weakness more dangerous. A nearly $60 million credit line, almost fully drawn, buried behind shell entities before tracing back to a longtime member of Aldercrest's own board. He understood the meaning immediately. He had seen this pattern before in other institutions, other files, other quiet internal failures. But never in the bank he was now about to inherit. He did not rush to regulators. Instead, he chose a path that was riskier, morally heavier, but more controlled. He brought in independent legal counsel, ordered a broad credit review under the cover of a post-inheritance audit, and confronted the board member privately. The conversation was calm, measured, almost polite in tone, but unmistakable in substance. 2 weeks later, the man resigned for health reasons. That was the moment he learned a lesson he would carry for years. Some secrets, once buried to save a system, do not disappear. They remain, even when no one speaks of them again. The independent review returned with even worse news than he had prepared himself for. More than $218 million in loans were reclassified as substandard. 3 large credits were moved into non-accrual. Aldercrest's Tier 1 capital ratio had fallen to 7.1%. The bank had not yet failed, but it was now close enough to the edge that survival could no longer be taken for granted. For the first time, the numbers stopped feeling abstract. They were no longer entries on a report. They were now his responsibility. Beneath those figures sat $2.9 billion in deposits and the trust of 84,000 customers who had no idea how fragile the structure beneath them had become. To stabilize the bank, he faced 2 obvious paths. He could raise capital and dilute his control, or he could shrink the balance sheet aggressively enough that the bank might survive on paper while choking off its own future. He chose neither. Instead, he engineered a third option. He brought in an outside investor for a 12% stake and secured $85 million in fresh capital, while giving up no board seat, no operating authority, and no real influence over the institution's core decisions. The Tier 1 ratio rose to 9.2%. He knew it was not victory. It was time, and only time. But for the first time since walking into Aldercrest, he was no longer just trying to keep a weak institution from falling apart. He was beginning to restore control. With that breathing room, he turned to the harder work, rebuilding the bank itself. He hired a new chief credit officer, someone who had lived through a full credit cycle and understood that institutions rarely die from a single catastrophic mistake. More often, they die from small compromises repeated too many times for too many years. He rebuilt the credit committee and gave it real authority, enough to stop loans rooted in relationships rather than analysis. Then he removed 3 senior loan officers who had become too comfortable approving risk with instinct, familiarity, and handshakes instead of numbers. One had been with the bank for more than a decade. Another cried in his office. He handled the departures fairly and paid respectable severance, but the experience clarified something important. What is painful is not always what is wrong. If you want to save a bank, sometimes you have to accept being the man no one wants to thank. 9 months later, Aldercrest's first wounds had begun to close. The non-accrual portfolio was shrinking. The loan book no longer felt like a brittle structure waiting for one more crack. For the first time, the institution looked as though it could truly be rebuilt, rather than merely stabilized long enough to postpone collapse. More importantly, his own thinking began to change. He was no longer just trying to save a decaying inheritance from a slow death. He began to imagine what Aldercrest could become if it were built properly from this point forward. That shift mattered more than any single report. He was no longer protecting a bank. He was beginning to design one. 18 months after taking control, he made his first acquisition, a community bank 40 miles outside the city with $680 million in assets. It was efficient, well-run, rich in deposits, and, most importantly, not internally rotten. The owner wanted out and had no successor. He saw more than a transaction there. He saw leverage, a foothold, a clean platform he could use to change Aldercrest's trajectory. He negotiated the purchase down from $92 million to $88 million and structured the payment with a combination of cash, stock, and subordinated debt. 4 months later, regulators approved the deal. When Aldercrest crossed $5 billion in assets, he understood he was no longer running a damaged institution through recovery. He was entering a different arena entirely. That threshold changed how he thought. He spent less time buried in individual loans and more time thinking in portfolios, systems, concentrations, and flows of risk. He began to understand the difference between managing a bank and building one. A manager reacts when weakness appears. A builder creates the conditions that make certain weaknesses harder to form in the first place. As his thinking shifted upward, the nature of his power changed with it. He no longer held only the power to respond to events. He held the power to shape the conditions from which future events would emerge. At $5.4 billion in assets, he began to understand the true power of a banking charter. It was not the public image of a local bank on a street corner. It was the ability to move capital more quietly and efficiently than most ordinary businesses ever could. He began originating loans and then selling them into the secondary market, collecting fees without carrying the full long-term risk. He expanded treasury services for local governments, participated in syndicated credits, and learned how to make money by distributing risk rather than simply holding it. Somewhere along the way, his internal identity shifted. He no longer thought like a banker in the old sense. He thought like a man directing the flow of capital across a region. 3 years in, the market finally began moving in the direction his models had long warned was possible. Interest rates climbed faster than expected. Commercial real estate, which had barely started to recover, stalled and then turned downward again. 2 major clients began showing visible signs of stress, creating a combined exposure of $74 million. It was not enough to kill the bank, but it was large enough to matter immediately. He had 2 choices: force liquidation, take the short-term pain, and keep the balance sheet clean, or restructure the credits, extend time, and preserve the businesses and jobs tied to them. He chose restructuring. On paper, it carried the lower expected loss, but on a deeper level, it also revealed something about him that had not been entirely extinguished by years of responsibility. He still had some capacity for mercy. By the 4th year, the results of his work had become visible in numbers few outsiders would fully understand. Aldercrest held $6.8 billion in assets. Net income had reached $94 million. His personal stake was estimated between $380 million and $420 million in the private market. Yet he had not sold a single share, nor had he ever paid himself more than $600,000 a year. His wealth had not arrived through a dramatic payday or a highly visible exit. It had accumulated quietly through retained earnings, capital discipline, and ownership of an institution, growing steadily on the flow of other people's money. That was when he began to understand why the truly rich in banking often live so quietly. Their wealth is structural before it is visible. In the 5th year, a much larger publicly traded regional bank with roughly $40 billion in assets approached him with an offer that would have unsettled almost anyone. They wanted Aldercrest. They offered him $680 million for his controlling stake. The proposal was astonishingly clean. No contingencies, no earnout, no obligation to remain in an operating role after the merger. He could take the money and walk away. He kept the offer to himself for 3 weeks. Then he refused it. Not because the number was too small, and not purely because of attachment. He refused because he knew that once he sold, the most important decisions affecting that institution would be made by people who had never truly lived inside the community the bank served. In the 6th year came the largest opportunity and the hardest test. A rival bank with $2.1 billion in assets failed its stress test. The FDIC moved quietly behind the scenes, and Aldercrest found itself on the short list of possible acquirers. He had 18 days to decide. If he moved forward, Aldercrest would approach $9 billion in assets and step into a far more intense tier of supervision. He did not hesitate. Due diligence began at 6 in the morning. By day 15, the transaction was done. After that, his name began to circulate in rooms where he had never before been invited, not as a technical analyst or local operator, but as someone whose decisions now mattered at a different level. From there, what changed was not only Aldercrest's size, but his position inside the wider ecosystem of power around it. The calls came faster. Partnership proposals, private deals, political offers, state treasury deposit opportunities worth hundreds of millions, and private equity firms looking to use Aldercrest as a banking partner for riskier lending strategies. At that level, the core skill was no longer knowing where to place capital, it was knowing when not to place it. He had entered a strange kind of power, one that required no public performance and almost no formal title beyond the one he already had, yet was strong enough that much of the region's commercial activity passed through his institution somewhere in its financial chain. But the deeper he moved into that world, the more clearly he understood the real cost. It was not hours, it was not meetings, it was not fatigue in the ordinary sense. It was the burden of living inside a system where a small chain of badly timed events could still change everything. At 44, after 6 years of running Aldercrest, he was not tired because he worked too much. He was tired because he knew exactly how many things had to continue functioning correctly at once for the balance sheet to remain standing. Capital was strong, the team was good, governance was better than it had ever been. Yet none of that guaranteed safety if the market entered the wrong sequence of shocks at the wrong moment. One night, after the calls had ended and the office had gone nearly silent except for the low hum of air conditioning, one loan kept him at his desk. A $38 million exposure to a warehouse distribution company with leverage above 5 times and covenant headroom narrowing quarter by quarter. The chief credit officer recommended loosening the covenant and waiting 90 more days. On paper, it was a defensible proposal, but he had seen that pattern too many times before. He knew that a 90-day extension like that could lead straight into workout, and from workout into a loss no one could contain. He set the file aside, but not really. Some credits stop being files the moment you understand them. They follow you into the night. Outside the glass, the market was already moving without him. Tokyo had opened. Shanghai was trading. Capital was shifting through the dark, according to a logic no regional bank executive could command to stop. And in that moment he understood more clearly than ever that he had never truly controlled this world. What he had done was build Aldercrest strong enough to absorb the next blow when it came. One day, as with every financial institution that survives long enough to outgrow the people who saved it, the bank would become larger than the man leading it. The balance sheet would develop a logic of its own. The market would hand down its judgment without asking permission. He was not afraid of that moment. He had prepared for it from the first day. But being prepared is not the same as remaining untouched. At 11:47 p.m., with the market opening in 6 hours, he reopened the credit report and returned to work, exactly as he always had.